Good afternoon. I would like for you to imagine receiving an emergency call that a family member or close friend is trapped in a dangerous situation. You are told that someone you love is being held in their own home by an abusive partner who has access to a firearm. Then imagine finding out later that there had been warning signs, but there was no effective intervention, and now it is too late. Sadly, for many families across the United States, this is not just a hypothetical situation. It is a reality that happens in real life. Today, I am going to share information about the connection between firearms and domestic violence fatalities, explain how lethality assessments help identify high-risk situations, and discuss how firearm restrictions associated with protective orders function as one evidence-based strategy used to improve survivor safety. This topic affects all of us because domestic violence occurs in every community, regardless of age, income, education, or background. Even if we have never experienced abuse ourselves, chances are we know someone who has. This issue is also deeply personal to me because on the weekend of June 13th of 2020, I lost my daughter in a domestic violence murder-suicide involving her fiancé, whom she attempted to break up with. I am now a senior social work student whose academic focus includes domestic violence advocacy, public policy, and survivor safety. Through my education and research, I have learned that many domestic violence fatalities are not random events. In many cases, there are identifiable warning signs that can help professionals recognize situations that may become deadly. First, let's look at the relationship between firearms and domestic violence fatalities. Research consistently shows that when a firearm is present in an abusive relationship, the likelihood that violence will become fatal increases significantly. Firearms not only have the capacity to cause lethal injuries quickly, but they also are frequently used as tools of manipulation, intimidation, and control. Victims may be threatened with a weapon even if it is never fired, creating fear that makes leaving an abusive relationship even more difficult. According to Elizabeth Tobin Tyler in the Journal of Law, Medicine, and Ethics, access to a firearm dramatically increases the probability that an intimate partner will result in homicide. Her research describes domestic violence and firearm violence as intersecting public health issues that require prevention-focused approaches. It is also important to understand that firearms are only one part of a larger pattern of coercive control. Many abusive relationships involve escalating behaviors that become more dangerous over time. This brings us to an important question. If warning signs exist, how can they be identified before the tragedy occurs? One evidence-based tool that professionals use is called a lethality assessment. A lethality assessment is a screening instrument used by law enforcement officers, victim advocates, and healthcare professionals to identify domestic violence situations that have a high probability of becoming fatal. Rather than relying on instinct alone, these assessments use research to identify behaviors that are strongly associated with homicide risk. Questions often focus on factors such as prior threats with a weapon, strangulation, stalking, escalating violence, forced control, or whether the abuser has threatened to kill the victim or themselves. The purpose is not to predict the future with certainty, but to recognize patterns that research has linked to increased danger. Jane Stover, in her research on firearms and domestic violence fatalities, explains that identifying these high-risk warning signs is critical to preventing deaths that may otherwise be preventable. Many people assume that domestic violence tragedies happen without warning. However, research does suggest that in many cases, there are indicators of escalating danger before a homicide occurs. Understanding these warning signs allows communities, law enforcement agencies, and victim service organizations to respond more effectively. Once a high risk situation is identified, the next step is determining what interventions may reduce the likelihood of further violence. The final point I want to discuss is the role of firearm restrictions and protective orders and how they can play as evidence based interventions. In many jurisdictions, courts may issue temporary protective orders when there is evidence of domestic violence or credible threats. In some cases, these orders are accompanied by temporary restrictions on access to firearms during periods of heightened risk. The goal is to reduce access to lethal means while the danger is at its highest. Research has examined whether these policies are associated with lower rates of intimate partner homicide. Danielle Wu, writing in criminal law practitioner, notes that improving firearm relinquishment procedures helps address gaps that may allow high-risk offenders to retain access to weapons despite court orders. In addition, research by Julie Kafka and her colleagues has explored how domestic violence protective orders and firearm restriction processes operate and how they can be implemented more effectively. It is important, though, to remember that these interventions are only one part of a larger coordinated response that may include victim advocacy services, law enforcement, counseling, emergency housing, and legal protections. No single policy or program can completely eliminate domestic violence, but researchers continue to study which approaches are associated with improved survivor safety. In conclusion, I'd like to say that domestic violence is not simply a private issue affecting individual families. It is a significant public safety and public health concern that impacts communities across our nation. Today, we have explored 3 important ideas. First, we learned that the presence of firearms significantly increase the risk that intimate partner violence will become fatal. Second, we discussed how lethality assessments help professionals identify situations that are at higher risk of homicide. And finally, we looked at how firearm restrictions connected to protective orders are one evidence-based intervention that researchers have associated with improved survivor safety. While there is no single solution to ending domestic violence, understanding the research and recognizing warning signs are important steps toward prevention. Through increased awareness, education, and continued study of evidence-based practices, communities can better understand this issue and support efforts to reduce future tragedies. Thank you.